first thing that is important to understand is that almost none of the equipment available for effects was ever designed for the pedal steel. What kinds of effects work well with the pedal steel? What kinds you might want to avoid? Ideas about how you might string them together, how I construct my effects rig. We're also going to talk about the fact that a lot of modern amplifiers have effects built in, and we'll discuss how you can use the effects that are in modern amps. If you decide to go with a processor, then you basically get locked into some certain settings. This time we're going to be talking about effects in the pedal steel guitar. And this can be a daunting topic because there are so many different kinds of effects available, literally hundreds of gadgets that could be used in any kind of combination of ways. So hopefully what we're going to do today is demystify those things a little bit. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I personally use for my own effects rig, the types of effects units I use, what kinds of effects themselves I use, the pros and cons of different approaches, and so forth. So the first thing that is important to understand is that almost none of the equipment available for effects was ever designed for the pedal steel. So as pedal steel players, we have to take existing equipment and technologies and adapt them for our purposes. And sometimes that can be a little tricky because most of the things available were built with guitar players in mind, and they have the option of using their feet while ours are tied up a lot. So we'll get into some ways around dealing with that sort of thing. The next thing we need to cover is the different types of packages that effects come in. And basically it boils down to two sorts of things. We have freestanding Stompbox pedals, and this is what guitar players, they'll take a lot of these and string them together in a pedal board to build their rig out of, and some steel players do that as well. And so Stompboxes, individual Stompboxes, is one way to go. The other option, and this is the option that I prefer, is an effects processor. And effects processors have a lot of advantages for the pedal steel, and I'll tell you what some of those are. Number one, size. They don't take up a lot of space. In fact, the ones that I'm going to be demonstrating today both fit neatly in my pack seat. Price. You get a lot of bang for your buck with processors. If you're buying individual Stompboxes to build a rig, that can get really expensive really quick. Another advantage to processors is that they're easy to use with your fingers. Their touch control makes it a little easier to navigate as a pedal steel player when you're dealing with having to have your feet tied up all the time. It takes less cables and connections when you're dealing with processors. When you get into Stompboxes, you have a whole lot of things to string together, more cables, extra stuff. Versatility is a big thing with processors. You can configure things inside processors in dizzying arrays, and that offers you a whole lot of different options. Signal quality. By eliminating excess cabling and excess connections, you end up with usually a cleaner signal path from the pickups in the guitar ultimately to the speaker in your amp or whatever you're using. Reliability. I've never had an effects processor fail on me in a live gig situation. They tend to be pretty rugged, pretty roadworthy, and pretty reliable. Another huge advantage that they have in more recent years is computer editing ability. And a little bit later on, we're going to get into explaining how some of that works and how it applies, especially to the pedal steel. It opens up a whole new world when you can go inside the processor, look at it on the computer screen, and control absolutely every parameter of everything that it does. Now, there are some important things to understand no matter what system you decide to go with, whether it's Stompboxes or a processor or some combination thereof. And by the way, I do use a combination. I have a very specific use for a Stompbox that I'll get into here as we go. But for the most part, it's important to understand that when you're using whatever effects you use, they've got to go somewhere in your signal path, somewhere between where you plug in your guitar and where it ultimately comes out your amp. And so where your effects go in your signal line greatly determines how they work or don't work for you. Another thing we have to consider is gain structure. So if we were to just plug in our guitar and maybe into our volume pedal and then into an amp with no effects at all, then that's going to produce a certain amount of signal from point A to point B. And if we start adding things in between, we have to make sure that that amount of signal doesn't change too drastically anywhere in the middle, so that we keep this gain structure thing intact. And there's also some other things to consider that are widely available, things like effects loops. Like a lot of amplifiers have effects loops in them. I'm going to be demonstrating a processor here in a little while that actually has effects loops built into it. And a lot of people wonder what those are used for. I personally don't ever use effects loops in any way for the pedal steel. I'm not ruling out the possibility that somebody might have a good use for them, but I go with the most simplistic, direct wiring configuration I can come up with to keep my cabling to a minimum and to keep my signal path as straight as I can possibly get it. Now, is there a downside to using a processor versus using Stompboxes? Well, one obvious answer to that question could be it's difficult to adjust your processor on the fly. With Stompboxes, you can reach down and turn a knob and change things and tweak as you go. So one slight limitation to processors is that once you write a setting, and by the way, we call those a patch, and I'll be describing a little bit later how patches work and the way they're constructed and so on and so forth. But it's important to know that if you decide to go with a processor, then you basically get locked into some certain settings. I personally don't mind that. I've been very careful to select settings that were pretty universally applicable to just about any live situation I find myself in. So I don't really find that to be a handicap. It is something to consider.
See the equipment our pros use at the best prices anywhere online. Support small business and save.